Welcome to the International Institute. My name is Ken Coleman. I'm the director of the Institute here, and I'm delighted to have our guest today to speak to us. This talk and his visit has been co-sponsored by 3 units. The first is the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at the International Institute. The second is the Political Science Department in LSNA, of which our guest Dan Levine was a professor for many years. I'll say some more about that. And the third is St. Mary's Student Parish, the Catholic community here on campus. This lecture is part of a lecture series that parish has called the Gabriel Richard Lecture Series. Father Gabriel Richard was actually one of the founders of the University of Michigan back in the early 19th century. And the lecture series that the parish sponsors, which is often in collaboration with units at the university, is named after him. And it's just an honor to have our guest today. Dan Levine is Professor Emeritus of Political Science. He arrived at the university in 1969 and taught here till 2012. He was department chair in 1999 and 2004. I've known Dan since I arrived here 21 years ago. He was always a wonderful senior colleague when I was a junior colleague, and then when he was chair, he actually was stupid enough to help get me promoted. And then we became kind of peer senior colleagues, and he was still a wonderful mentor and just a wonderful person and a good friend. And I've always appreciated his good humor, even though it's interesting Bronx humor. He's always been a very warm colleague and friend. So Dan has written, he's really one of the foremost experts around on religion and politics in Latin America. He's published numerous books, 3 of which are directly on religion, bishops, Catholicism, Latin America. Anywhere you go and they talk about Latin American studies at Michigan or religious studies at Michigan, Dan's name comes up. Even today, is Dan Levine still there? And I say, no, Dan is happily retired in Chicago, and that's where he lives now. And we were able to get him here yesterday on a train. Thankfully, that worked. So let me just say that to finish up, that the way this will work, he's going to talk for about 45 minutes or so. If you do have questions, please use the microphone. We are recording this. I got quite a few emails today from people who said I can't make it for a variety of reasons, which I can't even imagine why. And they said, I want to see this lecture. So we just at the last minute have decided to record it. And that means when you ask questions, use the microphone, please. We'll keep the dialogue going after the lecture. So on behalf of our 3 sponsors and the International Institute itself, I want to welcome Dan Levine, and just delighted to have him here.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the invitation. It's great to be back in Ann Arbor. I'm happy in Chicago, but it's nice to see Ann Arbor. It's a little weird to see Ann Arbor again, but I like it. And I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to share with you some thoughts on this topic. It's a nice big topic. Pope Francis and the future of religion in Latin America. I'm just going to dive right in to the topic. I'll explain this. I'll get to this picture soon. This is a photograph I took in Guatemala in 1968. This deals with the side of it, which is the future of religion in Latin America. But let me talk about this topic. It's a challenge in many ways. It's not easy to know where to begin. It's a challenge because the subject matter is so very dynamic, right? I gave a version of this talk in November at the University of Florida, and since then the Pope just keeps doing things and keeps saying things and issuing documents and statements and starting up initiatives, and all of these, they're very dynamic, and they really have changed the tone of things and the parameters of discourse, and they've opened up areas of reform, many of which seem to have been firmly shut. They've stirred all kinds of debate with equal measure of praise and concern and condemnation from progressives and conservatives in the church itself and in society more broadly. I'm going to quote from this apostolic exhortation, which I've actually read, and I think Rush Limbaugh read one paragraph in it. If you need a quick introduction to this topic, if you haven't read it, the New Yorker end of the year issue is a wonderful article by James Carroll, who's an excellent writer, and it's a wonderful cover drawing of the Pope doing snow angels. So the Pope is very dynamic, and the future of religion in Latin America remains very dynamic. Things continue to evolve and change in multiple ways, which are themselves the result of long-term transformations in the culture, the society, and the politics of the region, which are part of the creation of a much more open and mobile society than there was 50 years ago, with populations that are more urban, more educated, more accessible to mass media than ever before. These are all long-term transformations. They're broader in scope than any individual, even a pope, even this pope, is likely to be able to shift, much less contain, counter in significant ways. So it's not easy to know where to begin. And so I've decided to try to begin first with some comments on the future of religion. Just talk about that generally, then talk about a little bit about the Pope, his background, what he's done so far, the expectations that people had of him, and how most people's expectations, certainly my own included, have been confounded by what he's done and said, and then try at the end to put these two together insofar as possible, all within 45 minutes. To sum up, if I were to sum up the future of religion in Latin America, you can sum it up in a few words. It's flourishing, it's vital, it's creative, it's plural, it's multiple. There's just more religion everywhere than there was before, in more places, of more kinds, and above all, it's highly competitive. Terms like these bear witness to a period of tremendous change over the last half-century, have transformed the public presence and the private life of religion in the area. When I first went to Latin America, which is 1967, I first went with the idea of studying religion and politics, which is a few years later. These changes were just getting underway, but at that time, this is well over 40 years ago, the region was still on the whole viewed as overwhelmingly and automatically Catholic, like ivory soap, right? 98, 90, whatever it is, percent pure. Not just Catholic, but the kind of religious practice that was stodgy, not very innovative, and assumed to be supportive of established powers, of established institutions. Furthermore, the whole realm of religion was viewed through the lens of expectations about secularization, according to which religion, as belief, as practice, as public presence, would inevitably decline and fade away in the face of modernization. This was viewed as an inexorable and a desirable process by most people in the social sciences. As far as I'm concerned, these expectations have been pretty much exploded by what's happened in the last half century. This has been a period of great innovation and creativity in religion, in Latin America in particular, but not only there. New theologies, new forms of organizations, innovative uses of the mass media, a wide diffusion of Pentecostal forms of spirituality and practice. If anybody doesn't know what Pentecostal is, I'll explain it as we go along, but basically it's close contact with the dynamic power of the Holy Spirit through healing, through speaking in tongues, or whatever it may be. The numbers bear out the extent of change. The last book I published, which is this one, everybody please buy it. I look at the numbers very carefully. I spend a lot of time looking at the numbers on religion in Latin America. I mean, although it's true that about 40% of the world's Catholics are in Latin America, and the Western Hemisphere as a whole is overwhelmingly Christian, in these 4 decades, the proportion of those people describing themselves as Catholic in Latin America has dropped substantially from what was typically 9/10 or more to what's now commonly 2/3, 65, 70% in a lot of countries. Much of this change has come from the sharp growth of Pentecostal and neo-Pentecostal churches. Some have expanded from very small beginnings, like the famous Church of the Universal Reign of God in Brazil, and others are utterly new. This is where the growth is. I have some figures in the book, but basically Pentecostal churches have grown like 5,500% more than population. Catholic churches just lagged just behind population growth, to the point where Brazil, I think, is now the largest Catholic country in the world and the second largest Pentecostal population in the world. So they're losing market share. And these churches, I just want to say something about these Pentecostal churches quickly. They represent a notable departure from the historic Protestant churches of the region. There always was a Protestant presence in Latin America from the 19th century on and even earlier, but these were typically small churches that catered to immigrant communities. Welsh Methodists, English Anglicans, Swedish or German Lutherans, very tiny, very small. They struggled to expand, but they didn't really. These new churches differ in their emphasis, their practice, their leadership, their outreach. They're heavily Pentecostal, as I said, a big emphasis on healing, on material aid, some of them. Their leadership is homegrown, used to be all imported. They're homegrown. They're people often with an experience in the media in some places. They work very well with the mass media. They don't have a lot of sunk costs in established buildings and cathedrals and schools, so they're very flexible. They're where the population is. There's been huge degrees of demographic movement in the region. So they've been very dynamic. And this newness, one of my arguments is that this newness appeals to men and women who are coping with the experience of change. This has been a period, the last 50 years, of tremendous demographic change, accelerated urbanization, great violence, political changes. And many people seek a new form of community and sociability and solidarity, and the churches provide that to people. And in areas of great violence, they've provided people a way of taking a lateral step out of the violence into a community of the saved, and also leaving behind a series of habits which are, how can we put this, bad for you, like drinking yourself into a ditch, gambling all your money away, and all that. Now, as the new churches have consolidated, this is on the future side, as the new churches have consolidated, their political and social stance has changed also. Politics was once regularly condemned as a realm of sin and corruption to be avoided in favor of building up the community of the saved. But believers are now more commonly encouraged to join in as children of the light, seeing political participation as part of their duty as citizens. What was for a long time an unquestioned alliance with the right, political right, like capitalism was in the original Gospels, is much more loosened up now. You find alliances and connections and ideological diversity that were unthinkable 30 years ago. Some of this probably has to do with the end of the global Cold War. I once mentioned this in a talk in Latin America, and students said, "Has there been a war in the polar regions?" I didn't know about the Cold War. Whatever the case, this is a much more diverse and interesting and dynamic block than what seemed to be the case a long time ago. So these are the elements of the future of religion in the region. Flourishing, creative, plural, competitive, new kinds of life, new and varied kinds of practice. This is often explained as a result of the invasion of the sects, S-E-C-T-S, that's a term used by Pope John Paul in 1992, or as a simple function of globalization. My own view is a little different. What it is multiple simultaneous creation in many places. Waves of cultural creativity, which find expression here for good reasons, and there are historical parallels to this. In any case, I got a chance to view the future of religion 46 years ago in Guatemala. I took this photograph in Solala in Guatemala in 1968. And I just want to say very briefly what this slide shows. He's a preacher, right? He's preaching to an indigenous audience in a market day. Market's going on all around us. And if you can see this up close, it's got biblical texts, it's got hell, it's got the saved, it's like Pilgrim's Progress. It's the path of the righteous, the path of the sinner. I took that photograph a long time ago, as I said, and I saved it because it was a cool photo. Only later did I actually think to myself, this guy's a precursor of a lot of things that happened since then. People like him are now commonplace in the region. It's just about impossible to cross a plaza, to exit a bus station, to go out of a train station without encountering, or to walk through a market without encountering a preacher somewhere. Preaching, recruiting, inviting people to churches, and inviting people to meetings. And these are not isolated. They actually are parts of networks. This is just not an isolated guy. They're parts of networks that support them. This is the new public face of religion. For me, the old public face of religion was what I used to see in newsreels when I first went to Latin America in 1967. Remember newsreels? You used to see newsreels, and there'd always be a priest, a politician, and a military officer at the opening of some event, cutting the ribbon, giving awards to athletes, giving people housing, opening a factory, opening a bakery. You know, it's a perfect alliance of civil and religious power. That stuff still exists. I'm not saying it doesn't, but it's no longer the only public face of religion. It's striking, the difference. That set routine no longer dominates the public presence of religion. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that the Catholic Church is totally overwhelmed and without resources, right? They're losing ground. There's not much question about that. It remains everywhere, however, the single largest church. It continues to enjoy, in many cases, a privileged legal status. They don't have to register as a church in many countries. Other churches have to go to a public registry. They have privileged access to public resources for the upkeep of churches, for salaries of clergy and bishops in many countries. All this is stuff that the Pentecostal churches want too. And they're campaigning to get equal status. They're campaigning to get equal status also as spokespersons for religion, an equal place on public platforms. But the Catholic Church still has many resources. It's also not without change of its own, despite the fact that it has many sunk costs in buildings and structures of all kinds. They've done a lot of innovation in new structures beyond the parish, pastoral centers. They've managed, apparently, according to the numbers at least, to reverse the decline in clergy and sisters who they depend on heavily. That has been reversed. There are new Catholic Pentecostal movement, the Catholic Charismatic Renewal, which is one of the most vital social movements in Latin America, is very dynamic, and Pope Francis himself went out of his way to praise this movement, to say that his previous judgment, he had said years ago, these people confuse liturgical celebration with samba lessons. He said more recently, I don't think that the Charismatic Renewal movement merely prevents people from passing over to Protestant denominations. No, it is also a service to the church itself. It renews us. These movements are necessary. They are a grace of the Spirit. So he has changed his position on this and numerous other things, as we'll see in a moment. Now, so the Catholic Church still has some resources. They're losing market share. There's no question about it. They're just not as agile, and they have some inherited costs from the past. However one looks at the situation, some things from the past aren't coming back, right? The Catholic Church no longer has a monopoly. Period. That monopoly is not coming back. It's no longer the church. There are several. There's just competition out there. The assumption of control by the hierarchy, of top-down control, that they can say something and all these Catholic organizations will hop to it. One writer that I participated in the book where the editor wrote something about how Catholic organizations are the eyes and ears of the hierarchy on the ground. A lot of these organizations are hollow shells. They're not really there when you really get down to the ground level. So I don't know that they ever were as powerful as they assumed to be, but they're certainly not now. And also, the Roman Catholic Church in Latin America, certainly and everywhere, is notably heterogeneous internally. It is not a unified bloc. There are many divisions and many different points of view, and I'm going to quote her later, but my Peruvian colleague and friend, Catalina Romero, has referred to as a civil society in the church. Presses, religious orders, schools and universities, research institutes, all identified as Catholic, but not following the orders of any particular bishop, and certainly not of the Pope. Despite intense effort in recent years by numerous prelates, including the Pope and including the Archbishop and Cardinal of Lima, Cipriani, to rein all these people in and control them, and John Paul II and Benedict, these efforts have basically failed. It just has not been possible. And the vision that Benedict XVI outlined of a church that would and could be more homogeneous, purer, if perhaps smaller, and that could be a basis for reconquering society, reconquering Europe, is just not on. It didn't work. This has now been superseded by the kinds of message that this Pope Francis puts out of an open, a more pastoral, accepting outreach. It's a move beyond defensiveness, and I'll take a minute off my notes. I was asked years ago, the Catholic bishops in Latin America meet regularly, and their last big meeting was at Aparecida in Brazil, and I was asked to participate in a book, and I was asked to write something about the future as seen at Aparecida. And what I wrote was that the future looks like a really frightening place to the Catholic leadership at Aparecida. They're scared of the future. They see the future as a source of disorder. And therefore, what was needed was a defensive position to reinforce the world within. I was struck by the fear at Aparecida. I was criticized for that, but I still think it's true if you read the documents. But this, if you read this, it's worth reading, actually. Some of it brings tears to your eyes, really. It's very open. He's not changing some basic aspects of his belief structure, obviously, but the idea is to join joyfully in the world, right? And participate in it. And he has a number of very particular things to say, which I'll quote later on. So moving beyond this defensiveness, the idea of reconquering Europe, and the truth is that this is what the Catholic Church has to do. Christianity is a religion of the global South now in the 21st century. People have many sources of information. They're very mobile. They're very open. So it's worth looking at. They don't have another choice. That's the basic point I'm going to want to make here. Now, I want to say something about the political and social and economic trends that have produced this change. It takes a long time to do that, and I will say a little bit about it, but I want to put these general comments aside for a moment to talk about the Pope. This is the second half of this, or the other half of this, about Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the Jesuit and Archbishop of Buenos Aires. His election as Pope, I asked a friend of mine who was an Argentine Jesuit when he was elected, and he said, this is not a good sign, right? Because there's a lot of controversy, which I'll talk about the Pope's career and about the Argentine hierarchy. But I think all of us who were very pessimistic have had to rethink. We were too narrow in our view, and we assumed he was a creature of his history, and we were wrong. It's okay to be wrong as long as you can recognize it. So who is Jorge Mario Bergoglio? Well, among other things, he's the first pope of non-European birth in over 1,300 years. It's always worth reminding audiences that Christianity is not a European religion in its origins, right? Right? It starts in the Near East, and a number of its early famous leaders are what we would now think of as North African. So the Pope is nonetheless the first non-European origin person, although his parents are Italian, so I don't know if that counts, in over 1,300 years. But the main thing that I think is interesting is how he has confounded expectations, how he's changed the tone of discourse from the recovery of positions to outreach to openness. He has this wonderful term called mercying, to have a merciful position, to open people up and to greet them. And then, of course, this very famous phrase that rebounded around the world, which was, who am I to judge? He said, you're the Pope, right? Pope is, but if you read this, it's really worth reading. So he's altered the tone of public discussion while setting in motion some potentially very significant reforms to the institutions of the Vatican, which, to say the very least, have been plagued with problems in recent years, from leaks to continuing cover-ups of sexual abuse scandals, to financial scandals, to personnel problems in the Vatican, which is a very neutral way of putting it. They got a lot of problems, right? So who is the Pope? And where did he come from? When he was first elected, he seemed like a safe conservative choice. Everyone says he was the runner-up to Benedict XVI when he was elected. He seemed very much in the vein of his two predecessors, who were pretty conservative on churchy matters. His election may have been a recognition of the importance of the global South, but there's South and South. The Argentine Catholic hierarchy is one of the most conservative in Latin America, with an absolutely horrific history of complicity with the military and the worst excesses of the dictatorship. Some of it just letting be, some of it active complicity in crimes. There's just no question about this. No one has ever accused this Pope of that, and that's not the issue here. But he comes out of a milieu which is quite a conservative, and he seemed like a known quantity, somebody who wouldn't rock the boat. He was born in 1936 of Italian immigrant parents who came to Argentina 7 years before. His career in the church is not typical at all of somebody who became a bishop in that period. He had a late start. I interviewed a lot of bishops in various countries for a book of mine years ago, and they all seemed to go into the seminary at age 12 and come out in the 20s and not having seen the world, right? This man had a career, had an education experience, and then went into study with the Jesuits. When he finally was ordained, which was at the age of 31, his career was meteoric. He's ordained at 31. He's the provincial of the Jesuit order at 36. 20 years later, he's a bishop. 10 years after that, he's named a cardinal. He was president of the Argentine Conference of Catholic Bishops from 2005 to 2011. A very meteoric career. He's obviously a person of great talent and many important qualities. And I've talked a little bit about the Argentine Catholic Church. The thing about the Argentine Catholic Church, and this is something I have read a lot about, it's very controversial still. It's very deeply polarized, like the society itself, right? With people on the left, progressive, even revolutionary left, there was the famous movement of priests for the Third World. There were several bishops who were blown up and murdered during the period of military rule. But I think it's fair to say that the bulk of the hierarchy and the bulk of the clergy were on the right. Some of them on what we can only describe as the fascist right. Fascism was a very popular ideology in the Argentine military and in elements of the Catholic Church. Fascist, integrist, anti-liberal, especially visible during the last military regime, where, as I said, there was direct complicity with numerous horrific crimes, from being present during torture to denying torture, to participating in the illicit adoption of babies who were born to women who were political prisoners who were then killed. More than a few people are in jail. Former clergy are in jail. And the Catholic hierarchy has never, to this date, apologized for that or approached the human rights community, which was also heavily of Catholic origin. The famous Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, Adolfo Pérez Esquivel, all these are religiously inspired and were always kept at arm's length, if not entirely hostile by the bulk of the Catholic hierarchy. But this Pope, as the head of the Catholic Conference of Bishops, was a big change from earlier ones like Archbishop Tortolo, who was a person of the rigid extreme right. But this Pope has also shared that position. He's resisted trials and accountability, called for a balanced memory. The debate over memory is a big thing in Argentina. What is the historical memory of the dictatorship? How do we know about it? How do we honor it? And the call for a balanced memory usually says there were crimes on all sides, it was a war, but in fact, it was a war of the government against its people. So this is an issue. And he's also, as Archbishop and Cardinal, maintained a very strong position and continues to maintain it on issues which have come to center stage in the last few decades, particularly same-sex marriage, known in Spanish as matrimonio igualitario, egalitarian marriage, sexual education in schools, contraception, abortion, extension of the rights of women. And the whole Argentine hierarchy has been pretty tough on that. There was notable controversy surrounding Francis himself. Everybody know, if you don't know about this case, I'll summarize it very quickly, about the two Jesuits, Orlando Llorio and Francisco Halich, both of whom were working in poor neighborhoods in Villa Miseria, so they were known as curas villeros, people who were working there, clearly inspired by liberation theology. Both were kidnapped by so-called security forces, tortured in the Navy Mechanics School, which I have visited. You can't breathe when you leave there. Both of them ended up in exile. The truth is that those people engaged in this kind of work in Argentina were prime targets of the military. And the military arrested and tortured and killed all kinds of people. They liked to go for Jews and leftists, and they also hated Catholic leftists, because Catholic leftists were betrayers of the faith and the patria, and they had special interrogators who knew about theology. So arrests of this kind were not, they had special interrogators who would interrogate people about their theology. So arrests of this kind were not unusual, unfortunately, and I know about lots of them. And I've actually talked to some people who were arrested and tortured. The accusation about Francis is that by directing them to leave the area, to stop the work and leave, he essentially withdrew protection from them. I don't know that he may have had protection or not, but making them easy targets for the regime. There wasn't much protection available at that time for anyone, but he didn't do much. And he himself acknowledged this. He gave a deposition in a legal case in November 2010 in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. He stated, quote, that he had not done everything possible to take care of them. And he had just thought of them as zurdos, or lefties, right? Zurdo is a left-handed person, right? For their part, Iorio died in 2000. He made it clear that he believed that as Provincial Bergoglio had tried to undermine them, making them vulnerable to the military. Jalic has recently stated that Bergoglio did not report them to police, had nothing to do with their abduction. So it's still a controversial issue, right? And it's covered very well by James Carroll in his piece in The New Yorker. If you haven't read it, it's the best single introduction I know of. All this is by way of background, right? Just to explain who he was and where he came from and why he seemed to be a safe choice. But of course, as I said at the beginning, he spent a lot of time confounding expectations in his public statements, in his institutional reforms, and in a few documents like the Apostolic Exhortation. There are so many statements. Let's see. What do I have until about 5:15, right? All right. There are so many statements oncoming that I can only do a few highlights, but I'll try to do some. I've read most of the interviews. You can find them on the web. They're all translated. They're very carefully calculated. These are not spontaneous interviews. He knows what he's doing, I assume. And it's easy to understand the buzz that they sparked. They had such an impact because of the tone they set, the doors they opened, which were shut by his predecessors. There's just no question about it. Let me just mention a few points. He did this interview with the Jesuits, which is published in the Jesuit magazine America, and several others. He outlined this very much less defensive position, one much less focused on doctrinal niceties and conformity, and a position, as he himself says, based on being welcoming, forgiving, pardoning, healing. He compares the church to a field hospital after a battle, urges mercy. There's a great quote in here. He says, the confessional is not a torture chamber. It's an encounter with God's mercy, right? It's a very different tone. And quote, we cannot insist on, this is what became famous, we cannot insist only on issues related to abortion, gay marriage, and the use of contraceptive methods. This is not possible. I have not spoken much about these things, and I was reprimanded for it, but when we speak about these issues, we have to talk about them in a context. The teaching of the church, for that matter, is clear, and I am a son of the church, but it is not necessary to talk about these things all the time. He talked about, quote, for those who long for an exaggerated doctrinal security, those who stubbornly try to recover a past that no longer exists, they have a static and inner-directed view of things, and in this way, faith becomes an ideology among ideologies. Instead of being just a church that welcomes and receives by keeping the doors open, let us also try to be a church that finds new roles and is able to step outside itself. Another important point has to do with the Second Vatican Council. That's Second Vatican Council is 50 years ago. It's one of the most important events in the modern history of the Catholic Church. There's a great deal of renewal about it. I won't go into all the details of it, but it's very important, right? And 50 years is a big anniversary. When I was in Peru in the fall, and there were all kinds of forums about the 50th anniversary of the Vatican Council. The truth is that since the Vatican Council ended in 1965, there's been a struggle in the Catholic Church to control the meaning of it, to understand and control the meaning of the Vatican Council. with concern among many conservatives, continuing concern about how the council undermined authority and undermined unity in the church. For his part, this Pope Francis called the council the source of, quote, a renewal movement that simply comes from the gospel. Its fruits are enormous. He welcomed Gustavo Gutierrez to the Vatican. Gustavo Gutierrez is often talked about as the founder of liberation theology, a very distinguished Peruvian priest, clearly marginalized by the Pope's two predecessors. And the most well-known interview came on his flight back from World Youth Day in Brazil. That's where he issued the phrase, when asked what to do about gay or divorced people, he said, "Who am I to judge?" Right? It's a big change from doctrinal lectures. And he also squarely acknowledged the seriousness of the sexual abuse issue, although there's a lot to do still on this issue. And he has acknowledged the Catholic Charismatic Renewal movement. So he's opened up a lot of doors and welcomed a lot of things. It's a relatively decisive shift in tone and positioning. It reminds me of what supposedly his namesake, Francis of Assisi, said, which was, go forth and preach the gospel, use words if necessary, right? It's always one of my favorite phrases in Catholic history. On more explicitly political issues, the Pope has shied away from direct comment. In Spain, he was asked to speak on an occasion about martyrs from the Spanish Civil War. He sidestepped requests to ask for the Church's forgiveness for its complicity with Franco. He has sidestepped the issue of memory in Argentina. So he's treading carefully on a variety of fronts. And he has changed we can talk a little bit more about his particular appointments. He's already issued a lot of new appointments. He's appointed a bunch of new cardinals, many of whom are from the southern half of the globe. He's gotten rid of, demoted some notably conservative cardinals, American and Spanish. He's calling a synod for the fall. He has reformed the bank, started some things to reform the bank. I'd like to say something briefly about this document, though. This is actually fun to read. It's hard to think of this kind of thing as fun to read, but it's very interesting. It's very well written. The translation is very good. And I've studied Catholicism long enough to know what the word gospel means. It means the good news. So this title is The Joy of the Good News. And a lot of it is about preaching, what people should do when they preach. But a lot of it is also about the church's position in the economy and society, its attitude to people. It's a remarkable change of tone. And I'll just quote you this one paragraph, which I think, part of the one paragraph, which is the one that I think Rush Limbaugh read, which I think is paragraph 54. It's about trickle-down economics. In this context, some people continue to defend trickle-down theories which assume that economic growth encouraged by a free market will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. This opinion, which has never been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting. So Rush didn't like that. And one Fox News commentator said, Pope Francis is the Catholic Church's Obama. It sounds a lot like liberation theology to me. It's surprising. But a lot of this document is about how the church should position itself in the world and what its attitude should be more than specifics. He's not really a person who's going to give advice on economic policy. It's about positioning. And he strongly denies the notion that the church should not have a position on these things. He strongly rejects that. So drawing an interim balance, I would say the general position is one of openness, described in religious circles as pastoral, opening, welcoming, working hard for new kinds of connections with society. And as I said, he's taken some initiatives to open up the bureaucracy of the Roman Curia, appointments of cardinals, a council to advise him, of 8 cardinals to advise him on, called the Synod, shaking up the bank. I have some comments here, some reactions to him. Michael Novak, who's a well-known right-wing American Catholic commentator, said, quote, does he understand the harm he's doing? The Archbishop of Lima, who's a leading figure in Opus Dei, Archbishop Cipriani, well known for his opposition to human rights movement, to liberation theology, who's been locked in a legal battle, which is Dickensian, with the Catholic University of Lima for years now. He referred to the Pope's welcoming of Gustavo Gutierrez as ingenuous and naive, right? Ross Dreyer, the editor of the American Conservative, said, quote, "The Pope has done more damage than he realized because his interview is widely interpreted as a pontifical command to surrender the culture war in the name of pastoral prudence, and because people see it as such, it undercuts the fight for religious freedom." Bill Donahue, who's the president of the Catholic League, a kind of person who can't admit that a pope says anything wrong, states that the interview is misrepresented. On the Catholic left, there's like elation, is all relief and elation. I only got one quote. I participated in one forum, online forum in the Times, which is right when he was elected, and then there was another one in September, which has a totally different tone. The one in September was on the title of, "Did the Pope Tip the Political Scales in the U.S.? By stirring debate on economic and social issues, did he change things?" Well, among other things, he has urged the bishops not to talk about more than just abortion, right? Not to change their view on that, but to talk about more than that. And there's another quote in here which says, there was a controversy, you may remember, about the whether or not Catholic politicians who support abortion rights should be able to participate in the Eucharist. And there's a quote in here which says, "The Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect, but it's nourishment," right? It's a very different point of view. Sister Simone Campbell, who's the executive director of Network, a social lobby, says the Pope's statements are a breath of fresh air, a broader view of the value of life than just birth control. It refers to the kind of view associated with the late Archbishop of Chicago, Bernardin, who talked about a seamless garment, that you couldn't be opposed to abortion without opposing capital punishment, or war, or poverty. They're all kill people. So now I've skipped over some of these. There's a lot more quotes that one can do, and I could do some of these in discussion, but I want to see if I can put these two issues together about the Pope and the future of religion in the next 10 minutes or so. How can we think about the impact the Pope might have on the future of religion, of the Catholic Church itself, and religion in Latin America more generally? What's likely to happen? I mean, it's hard to know, obviously, and it's easy to assume that whatever is happening in the last 50 years is going to continue to happen in the future. On the other hand, what we see in Latin America are really long-term changes which have come to fruition, it seems to be, in these last period. So what can the Pope do? I'm going to try to break this question down into three parts, from the easiest to the most difficult, right? The first and the easiest one is whether the changes set in motion by Pope Francis can have some impact in stopping the bleeding in numbers and the public position for the Catholic Church, restoring its position. It still has a strong position, but restoring it a little bit, opening up its alliances, changing it a little bit. On this point, I've mentioned there are a lot of changes already underway in the Catholic Church, but Catholic Church does remain highly dependent on male clergy. That's a diminishing resource. Most of them remain constrained. It's harder to shift and be flexible. A church, as I've mentioned, can't rely on its network of old organizations anymore. The pattern of belonging that people indicate in surveys and studies to Catholic organizations is now much more voluntary and selective and volatile, much less automatic. There's much less automatic belief and following orders. As a general matter, this is part of a general notion of secularization. Secularization is more than a decline of religion. Secularization also has to do with a belief in autonomy and choice and plurality. And the emergence of autonomous citizens and groups in a secularized and open society changes the way in which society is open to the church. For those wedded to the idea of the church as the unique source of norms and values, there are problems here, and I'm just going to indulge myself. Every social scientist who wants to be cool quotes Tocqueville, on religion in America, and I want to quote Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville in the 1840s said that it's precisely where religions have been separated from other institutions, where there is no established faith, that religious practices flourished and diversified, a fact lost on many American Catholic bishops. He recognized, quote, that the very effort to prolong the existence of Christendom did grave damage to institutional religion. And here's the quote, in Europe, quote, so long as religion derives its strength from sentiments, instincts, and passions which are reborn in like fashion in all periods of history, it can brave the assaults of time or can only be destroyed by another religion. But when a religion chooses to rely on the interest of the world, it becomes as fragile as all earthly powers. Alone it may hope for immortality. Linked to ephemeral powers, it follows their fortune and often falls together with the passions of the day sustaining them. He wrote that, what is that, like 170 years ago. So that's the task for the Catholic Church and for many Catholic leaders who remain wedded to the notion that you need public support. It's a real shift, real cultural shift, particularly where there's always been an established church in Latin America, to move away from that. So that's the first question, is can they move away from this image? And it's not easy, right? I want to talk about secularization, but I want to talk about the second question, a medium difficulty, which is how the church can reposition itself in public space, right? They're no longer the church. They're no longer the only voice out there. So what do they have to do? They're one among many. When everybody's a minority, it's in everybody's interest to keep the space of competition open. So it's good for them to have free speech now. The old Catholic position was there's no place for error next to truth, right? But as I understand the Vatican Council, at least, it recognized many paths. And anyway, Catholic Church can't enforce that anymore. So the point is that in this kind of environment, reaching and moving people can no longer be accomplished by fiat, by pastoral letters. You've got to persuade, coax, cooperate, multimedia approaches to mobilization. There are already lots of ecumenical initiatives in Latin America, lots of alliances about some issues, including abortion. So I think they're moving to that, but it's a little slow. Now, I've talked about globalization. I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit to the last one, which is about secularization, then I'll try to conclude. Secularization is a big topic in the social sciences. Jose Casanova, who's probably the scholar who's written most about this, claims that it's the dominant topic and the dominant established wisdom in the social sciences in the last 100 years. And there's a lot of truth to that. Discussions about secularization, I've always thought, suffer from two problems. The first is that it's typically understood in terms of inexorable decline. The decline of religion is assumed to come as a result of the diffusion of learning, science, and well-being, which leads to the steady erosion of belief, practice, and affiliation. This is modernization, right? This is reinforced by the expansion of the secular state and the separation of religious from secular institutions and obvious things, schooling, registry of births, deaths, cemetery, public health, education. That's very obvious historically in Europe. The problem is not that there are no impacts. This is very documented in the case of Western Europe. The problem is that the various aspects of religious change, separation of institutions, decline of belief, change of practices, don't necessarily vary together. Anyway, there are other interesting questions to ask, which is, for example, how do churches and religious people continue to act and position themselves in more secular environments? What do they do? How do they change? Anyway, it doesn't exhaust the questions of interest. How do they position themselves in public life? How do they operate as organized groups? Now, I want to offer one other issue on secularization and then an anecdote. Another problem is that secularization is often conflated with secularism. And this is the case in many recent statements by the American Catholic bishops who treat them as the same. It's not the same at all. Secularism is a deliberate attempt to rein in and control the place of religion in public life. People often refer to the French model of laïcité, in which the church is removed from a public role. In Latin America, post-revolutionary Mexico, Uruguay renamed all its public holidays, getting rid of religiously linked names. But it's not the same thing at all. What we see in Latin America today, on the first hand, is not secularism, not militant secularism, not much anyway, not in some places. Where it was, in Mexico or Uruguay, it's in retreat anyway. What we see is not secularization. In a simple way, what we see is secularization of culture and politics with independent groups, with religious diversity and vitality. It's an interesting conjunction of events. Religion's not disappearing, but it's flourishing. But there's a renegotiation of what religious life means in the public sphere, and people belong differently. Now I want to give you my anecdote. I was in Bogota, Colombia, 2 years ago, for the first time in a long time. I used to live in Bogota. I spent a lot of time there, but I hadn't been in many years. I was invited to lecture and speak about a book on democracy in Latin America, but I took advantage of the time to give a talk about this new book, this more recent book on politics and religion, available to anyone who wishes. After the talk, I was approached by a young priest, a very nice young man who worked in the Secretariat of the Colombian National Bishops' Conference. His name was Pedro Mercado Cepeda, a very Colombian name. He asked for some time to talk with me, and he said, when we did talk and we found time, he said, the bishops are very concerned about what they saw as a decline of values in a public and private morality, mostly about values surrounding family and gender roles, which is what the bishops are afraid of. They're afraid of women, among other things, but they're afraid of change here. They were searching, he said, for a more effective way to respond in the context of what they saw as a broad process of secularization, fueled by globalization and mass communications, visible in popular culture, public discourse, and patterns of private life. They could see it all around them, he said, but they couldn't quite figure out how to act. They couldn't figure out the best way to get their message across. So I talked to him about a few things. I said, first of all, I pointed to the fact of religious pluralization. It's a fact. Even in Colombia, it's a fact now. In the context of a more open and diverse civil society, a phenomenon visible everywhere in the region, including very conservative, reliably conservative countries like Colombia. If the Catholic Church is to be realistic, it has to see itself as one actor among many. They can't just issue directives. They're one voice among many. They have to convince and commit people who have access to lots of information. Many sources of, many voices, many options. I also talked to him about different ways of understanding secularization beyond this notion of decline of religion. The model for this is the decline of belief and practice in Western Europe, which is very well documented. I think there are more Muslims than Methodists in Britain now, and churches are mostly empty. It's just a true statistical fact, right? But Western Europe is not necessarily a universal model for everything. In Latin America, although if you look at the census numbers, there is a small but growing number in each census of each country who report no affiliation, who claim they have no religion whatsoever. The broader results show a surge in religious movements, many of them new, leading to this rearrangement that I mentioned before. Secularization with religious vitality in a context in which people exercise their personal and group autonomy and make choices. Oh, I do have one more, yes. I pointed out to him that in this light, many people who consider themselves faithful Catholics could and did in full conscience, tranquil conscience, simply disregard directives from the hierarchy. They don't pay attention. American women have never paid attention to the birth control thing in this country, and the same is true in Latin America. An Argentine colleague of mine points to the fact that there are many, I'm missing some notes here, points to the fact that there are many people who describe themselves as católico a mi manera, or católico por cuenta propia. I'm Catholic in my own way, I'm Catholic on my own account. And he argues that in Argentina today, people don't believe more or less, they just believe in different ways. So, hold on. All right, yes, sorry. What this means, of course, is that traditional church strategies aimed at reconquering civil society are unlikely to be effective. They can't work by decree. It's a different world out there. And there's also spaces within the church itself that are not going to fall in line automatically. So what's required is coalition building, convincing people, building alliances across traditional divides. I talked with them a little bit about the fear of the future that I saw in the documents at Aparecida. This is not a fear about just losing numbers, or that's part of it. It's really a fear about loss of control. that if you don't have control, then everything's going to fall apart. But that isn't necessarily true. It reveals a very, how can I say this, a lack of faith in the solidity of the faith of their followers, right? If they don't have control, it won't stay, but they're not going to have that control. It's just not there anymore. So what are they going to do? So that was the nature of my conversation with Padre Cepeda. This lack of control is a real problem for them. He was very polite, right? And he said it was all very interesting, and he would report back, but I don't think he was very convinced, and I doubt that they have much impact on what the church is going to do. So, in Colombia. All right, I have very little time left, so let me say something about what the Pope himself can do. Well, I'll just try to wrap up briefly. As usual, I have enough notes to talk for about 45 hours. So, what can you expect from the Pope? What impact will he have on the future of religion in Latin America? It's not easy to change the Catholic Church, right? It's been around for 2,000 years. It's a very complicated institution with lots of nooks and crannies, and there's lots of resistance within the Catholic Church to these initiatives. There's no question about it. And some of my more cynical Latin American friends say, well, there are a lot of nice words here, right? What's going to happen? I think words are important. I think that they set an example. They set a personal style and a moral example. They put new issues on the agenda. So I think that part of what the Pope has done is very important. He resets the parameters of discourse. Second question is, will he stop the bleeding? I don't know. He may rally the troops, which is part of his goal, but it's likely to be some of them and not all of them, right? And there'll continue to be dissent. There'll continue to be foot dragging within the church. And it's if you read the sociology of religion, which is a subspecialty of mine, liberalization may not stop the bleeding. There's a long literature in the sociology of religion about why strict churches are strong. They're strong because they reinforce the bonds within. You loosen those bonds, the borders get a little more porous, so it may not stop the bleeding. The Catholic Church in this country has been losing numbers. If it weren't for Hispanics, Catholic Church numbers would be way down, much further down than they are. So it's not clear to me that he will necessarily stop the bleeding, but it is clear to me that a more open, less defensive stance, one that incorporates expectations of diversity and plurality, is not just a good way to go, it's really the only way to go. Given the depth of religious change, what the Pope can do is incremental change. And he's starting to do this. If you look at the appointments he's doing, it depends a lot, obviously, on how long he lives and how effective he is and who comes next. But he's altered the terms of debate. He's trying to clean up the church's bureaucracies. And his new appointments are very, very interesting. I don't expect much in the way of political initiatives. I don't think that's where his emphasis is. One thing about religion in Latin America, coming back to the Pope and future of religion in Latin America, looked at from the point of view of ordinary people, what's different about it now is that there are choices for most people. I once described the nature of religion in rural Latin America. It's like a big funnel effect. There was only really one option for many people, but now there aren't. I mean, the diversity of materials and broadcasts and flyers available at every level, almost everywhere, is quite startling. And this is a change that has to be reckoned with, but an entirely defensive operation isn't really going to work, I don't think. Assuming that the Pope is able to consolidate and extend some of the reforms he set in motion, this creates another possible moment for the Catholic Church. And my note says, I think in Spanish sometimes there's a punto de inflexión. It's a point of possible change for them. If he can change the way the Church presents itself, making itself seem more open and welcoming, they have an opportunity to reach into society in a different way. It doesn't require any shift in core positions, and I don't think you're going to see that, although it's not impossible that this will happen. But it seems to me the Church has no choice but to try to adapt to this new society. I have a very poetic way of ending this, but I won't go into that because I've used enough time. But it's a very dynamic situation. The Pope is really done some fascinating things. If you haven't read this piece by James Carroll, it's really very good. And as I say, I had a lot of fun reading this, believe it or not. You don't normally have fun reading church documents, but it's fascinating and very interesting. So thank you very much. I'll be happy to elaborate on any of these things in discussion. Thank you. Oh, just about right. I'm just about right on time, I think. So now I think, do you have a microphone circulating, Ken? You do. So I'd be happy to respond to any questions or comments or talk more. Yes, hi, Sharon.
Well, I'd like to hear a little bit more about how this pope has been received in Argentina.
Oh, you know, he's wildly popular, I think, wildly popular. Even in Brazil, when he first was elected pope, they said, well, the pope may be Argentine, but God is Brazilian, right? Now they say, you know, he could be Brazilian. So I read some of the Argentine press most days, although I tend to read the lefty press. I try to read Página 12, which is like the Guardian of Argentina, and I look at Clarín also. The Pope is very popular. It's not surprising. My Argentine friends who are deeply into the human rights movement and the memory movement, their position is that if he really wants to make a change, what he should do on a trip to Argentina is go to the offices of the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo, embrace them, and ask for forgiveness. I don't know if that's going to happen. On the other hand, you know, if you read his famous interview that the Pope had, they said, on one of his interviews, he said, how would you describe yourself? He said, I'm a sinner. Right? And he said, this is not just a phrase. And I don't know Pope, obviously, but it seems to me that that he may be thinking about his own church and his own involvement in the case of these two Jesuits, which was not isolated. So I think he's wildly popular for the moment. I'm certain now, we haven't heard from the more conservative elements. The Argentine Catholic Church has, I think it still has the largest military vicariate of any church in the region, which says something, right? They're very closely related. The military vicariate are priests whose particular role is to minister to the military, who are attached to garrisons and regiments and who preach to the military. And I'm a big fan of the investigative journalism of this Argentine writer, Horacio Verbitsky, who a lot of my friends in the center and right can't stand Verbitsky, but Verbitsky has about 5 volumes in which he looks at the history of the military preaching, which is absolutely terrifying to read, right? But the truth is the Argentine church is polarized and very divided, but the dominant element was this. So I think the Pope is very popular now. I don't think he's changed any of the positions that they had about, you know, it's very easy to demand accountability from others, but not to accept it for yourself. And on sexual abuse issues, on the whole question of memory, which is a very big issue in Argentina, for all their faults, the Kirchners have at least put that one out on the public agenda. So I think he's very popular. That's the answer. And he's very popular in the U.S. if you read the polls, and except with Rush Limbaugh, you know. Poor Rush. Kathy, yes.
Thanks. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
This is more of a comment. My sense is that this Pope is very bright. He's run organizations. He knows about change and how to affect change, and that remind me how long he's been around. Has it been?
As Pope?
Yeah.
It's less than a year.
Less than a year, and you know, he's
a lot of work in less than a year.
Right, exactly. And my sense is that, well, my hope, I guess, also is that, you know, he's moving along in a way that he thinks is going to work, and making some initial changes and statements, and he's got time to kind of rock things more.
And the appointments,
Yes.
seems to me in the long term, the appointments are what matters, because his two predecessors really restocked the hierarchy, Catholic hierarchy in the world.
Yeah.
There's no question about it.
My other comment, and I don't know if this is correct or not, but as I recall, John the 23rd was kind of brought in. Yeah, he's kind of old. He's not going to be around that long. He won't cause too much trouble. And boy, did he cause trouble.
Yes.
And it was a very great thing that he did.
He was a little over 4 years. in
Yeah,
office,
it's
and
kind
he-
of like wasn't Earl Warren brought in also as a sort of a quiet head of the Supreme Court. He won't do much, and then he's upset. He effected changes that I would support.
As we say in the Department of Political Science, American politics is not my field. So, but it's certainly true. He's been Pope for very little time, and it's been a startling change. And if you've spent any time with people in the Catholic left in Latin America and you read some of this, it brings tears to your eyes. It just does, right? It's quite a remarkable document. So there you are. Any other questions, comments? Yes, Patrice, Bruce. Sorry.
I have a very specific question. You twice referred to the conference at Aparecida, and strangely, the Pope has also in many formal discussions referred to the conference at Aparecida as his inspiration and as the inspiration for the changes he's making now. So I wonder if you've thought about going back
So the
and
document?
revisiting it, and whether you might take away a very different sense of what actually happened, or whether you understand him as essentially taking a position very similar to yours and then saying, we really need to do something about this.
I can comment on that, sure. I don't want to go back. I retired. So it's a very interesting I read the documents at Aparecida, right? One of the things if you want to study religion, you got to get into it. You have to read the documents. You have to see what people say. You can't just ignore them. But it wasn't only the documents at Aparecida. The process of the documents at Aparecida is very interesting. There were documents which were then edited by the Vatican in a much more conservative direction before they were released. So there's no question about that. But if you look at Aparecida is not all one thing. I took away this element of fear. But Aparecida talks about a lot of things. It talks about the need for new approaches in the cities. It talks about something which doesn't talk about it much, but it's very visible now. I've written about this in something else recently. Violence and religion in Latin America. The church has played a big role in addressing violence and participating in it and reacting to it. The nature of violence is almost like some people talk about the new violence and the old violence. The old violence in Latin America was civil wars, revolutionary movements. The new violence is drugs and gangs, and the new violence in Central America has taken more lives than the Civil War took, right? And the responses to the new violence against migrants, violence in the neighborhoods, violence from drugs, has been, not surprisingly, much more decentralized and diverse than in the past, because there's a lot more churches as actors there. For example, evangelicals are in the prisons in Latin America. They work with gangs. The Catholic Church also works with the gangs, but not quite as much and not in quite as flexible a way. In everything from negotiating truces to providing tattoo removal clinics for gang members. People tattoo themselves all over. And if you want to leave the gang, and the gangs will allow people to leave. Normally, if you want to leave the gang, you're dead, right? That's the way you go out. But at least in Central America, they'll make an exception for people who do so because of a religious conversion, which they maintain. There's a great book on this called Homies and Hermanos by a friend of mine, and it's very interesting. So Aparecida also talks about the new dimensions of urban life. It talks about ecology. It talks about many issues. And the main theme of Aparecida, which I think the Pope is reacting to, is missionary disciples. That people should be missionary disciples. But what I took as the tone of Aparecida was people should get together behind their leaders and have a unified presentation. This is also missionary disciples. That's what this is about. But it's a looser, not less disciplined, but less subject to discipline approach. So I think it's a matter of tone and approach. That's what I would say. So I might go back and read the documents. They're pretty interesting. Patrice wanted to make a question, and then there are two more.
To what extent do you think that the College of Cardinals had a clue as to what was coming?
Well, if you read James Carroll's piece, obviously I don't know, right? Probably not as much as, but of according to James Carroll, when the College of Cardinals meets, right, and they close the doors and they shut everybody out, somebody gives a kind of an address, which is supposed to set the agenda for the discussion. And according to Carroll, who knows a lot more about this than I do, Benedict XVI gave the address before he was elected, talked about contrasting the church with the relativism of the world and overcoming moral relativism. But whoever gave the speech this year, who was a very ancient cardinal, said, there is a real crisis here. We need to face up to what's going on in the world. And he lectured them about the world and openness and change. So I don't know the answer to that. I assume that he was very well known, Bergoglio. First of all, he was not an unknown quantity. But whether they thought he was going to change the way he did, I don't know. After I wrote what I wrote that was in the Times, I got a letter from a friend of mine who was for 40 years the advisor to the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops on Latin American questions. A guy named Tom Quigley, who's a graduate of this university. And Tom wrote, I was very interested to read what you wrote, but you're all wrong. He's not going to be like that at all. And later on, I wrote to him and said, Tom, you were right and I was wrong. Right? Very hard to admit you're wrong, but I was wrong. And I think they didn't know the dimensions of what they were getting. I doubt it very much. And you can see it by some of the reactions of some of the more conservative prelates who've been grumbling and mumbling about the nature of change and that he wasn't talking enough about this or about that. But so I imagine they were not aware of this. They knew who he was, but and apparently as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, this is not inconsistent with his behavior in office. So I understand, right? In the sense that he led a relatively simple lifestyle. He emphasized, there's some great quotes in this exhortation about Church of the Poor, the kind of church he wants, not to just be for the poor, to be poor itself. And that, style issues have an impact on people. It makes you feel that someone is more authentic if they actually don't just talk the talk, but walk the walk. So I don't know the answer, but they got him. We'll see what happens next. If the Catholic Church has any sense, future popes will come from the southern half of the world. That's where it is, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that these are all going to be liberalizers. There's a lot of pretty conservative people in the southern half of the world. In Latin America and Africa, churches are not all liberalizing in the sense that we like to put issues together. You might put social and economic liberalization together with gender equality, but they might not do that. So, I don't know. But it's very good to get that out of Italy, and it's just, the world has changed. I think Phil Jenkins has these books on the new Christendom. He says by, mid-21st century or by the end of this century, 65% of the world's Christians will be in the southern half of the globe. This is a religion. The Americas North America is an exception to the northern hemisphere rule. So it's very interesting. So, sorry, there are a few more questions. There you go.
Is this on? Okay. This is similar to what you just addressed, but I want to see if you can take it a little bit further. And maybe you don't know the answer, but you started out saying that the Pope Francis has confounded a lot of people. So it sounds like it's a departure. And then you say he's very well known and was very well known. So if people are confounded, it seems like he's undergone some kind of change. And I wonder if you have any hints as to that. I mean, certainly he was not, he lived a simple lifestyle in the most recent years. Is that just recent as Archbishop, or has that been ever since, his ordination sort of thing? Or did he have a conversion experience? Do we have any clues as to that? Because it seems like he can't have been completely consistent. Then people wouldn't be so surprised at the breath of fresh air.
Yeah, I don't really know. The model for that, people always cite the model of Archbishop Romero in El Salvador, who, on his appointment, was widely viewed as a conservative prelate who would just enforce whatever there was, and had an experience of change as a result of his dealing with people, visiting towns and dealing with the violence and friends of his being murdered. There's no comparable account of the Pope's own history which would give you insight into that. His own comments about his behavior. In the case of Yalich and Yorio, makes you think that he's probably reassessed things. And a lot has come out at Argentina in the last few years, more than the last few years, last half dozen years. Details about the church's involvement with the military, which are pretty horrifying. I mean, I haven't talked about them, maybe we could talk about them. Everything from being present during torture, blessing torturers, telling them their work was necessary, the business of adoption of babies, they're deeply involved in it. There's a famous case of this priest, von Wernick, who's in jail for many crimes of murder, torture, illicit adoption. There's more than a few, right? So I think that this is probably part of it, probably rethinking this experience. Also, he is a Jesuit. Now, there's conservative Jesuits and there's all kinds of Jesuits, right? This is like everybody. But one of the things about the Jesuit order is you're exposed to lots of influences, more than you would being an ordinary old parish priest. You're just exposed to more. And the Jesuits, who were harshly chastised by John Paul II, had a long-standing position in this vein. And as far as I'm concerned, it's entirely possible to have a strong social and economic and welcoming message with a conservative theological stance. It's entirely possible. And I imagine this will continue to evolve. So I don't know enough about the workings of his personal life, and no one has revealed this. As far as I know, I have a paper here somewhere among this pile of papers by I've worked with a bunch of people at the University of Buenos Aires who work in this area of sociology of religion, and they've produced tons of stuff since he was elected Pope trying to figure out where he came from, who he was. And they describe him as a person who is very skilled at positioning himself in public life, just as Kathy said, at organizing things. Not surprising, he had a meteoric career. They don't talk much about his ideology and its evolution. All I can say is reiterate what I said. On the issues of sexuality, not just abortion, but abortion, access to contraception, gay marriage, all that, they've been very firm. On the other hand, his position about people is very different from what one would expect given that public position. And as far as I know, he's relatively been consistent in that, although he's never been a public proponent of that. So it's a puzzle, and maybe some future biographer will tell us more about this, but I just don't know. One more question. All right, well, we have two people. We could fit two people in, but then no more.
Hi, Dan. Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Sorry, my knee is hurting me. So.
It has been worth coming out in this weather. I was in Cuba recently, about a month ago, and that's a very different case in Latin America because it was a communist nation for so long and still is in most ways. But one of the things that has really changed in Cuba is that after 30 years of there being a huge silencing of religion, and people not ever going to churches because they were afraid that going to being seen in a church had social costs. Yes. Your child might not get into a scholarship in the university. You might not get a refrigerator from the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution and so on. And now the churches are full. And I spent a lot of time with a couple of priests who are very good friends of mine, a Protestant minister, and going with them to services and doing what they were doing. And I saw that now their churches are all full. They're full of people, and they're probably the only people that are not there are actually men. It's mostly women, but it's both very old to very young people, okay, although one notices the male absence, lots of children. So it's now accepted to be inside of a church, but what my friends who are priests and ministers and so on point out as their problem is that they don't have enough of them to go around. So they have to go and attend to very rural sort of communities, very poor people, and take on 4 or 5 more churches in addition to the one where they live. And they think that there's 2 problems that lead them to not having enough priests and ministers. One is the fact of celibacy, which doesn't inspire a lot of young people to join the church. And the other is, in fact, the problem that they're not having, but it has spilled over, and that is the sexual abuse problem in the United States, but that it has impacted them also negatively.
Sexual abuse problems all over Latin America. I dug up a whole bunch of, there's a lot of cases that aren't very well reported, but it's not only here. It's all over. all over. So there's absolutely. There's one more questioner back there.
Hi, I have a question about you and your choice of studying the church in Latin America. What can you tell us a little bit about what interested you about culture, politics, and the church in South America rather than going to Europe and studying the changes there?
That's a very good question. You know, a lot of, I thought about it a lot lately, actually. Why I came to study Latin America and how I got interested in religion. I didn't originally go to study religion in Latin America. I originally did something quite different. For Latin America, my undergraduate thesis advisor, my thesis was not on Latin America, it was on the sociology of knowledge, was the founder of the Latin American Studies Association and was interested in promoting good people to study the region. And I didn't know anything about Latin America until I met Kalman Silvert. I met him, and he was the only course that was ever challenged me in college. I thought it was really interesting. I learned a lot from him. And I knew absolutely zip about Latin America. I first went to Latin America in Venezuela in 1967. And I didn't study religion. I studied the creation of the democratic system there. And one of the case studies I had, however, was about how the Catholic Church became accommodated to and supportive of democracy, whereas in the previous centuries, they had opposed it as threatening. What had changed for them, and what had changed in democracy, and what had changed about them? And that got me interested, and then I read a book. I'm an academic, so I read a book by a book I no longer agree with, by a man named Ivan Valier, who was a well-known sociologist, called Catholicism, Social Control, and Modernization in Latin America. It was written in 1970. And just listen to the title, Catholicism, Social Control, and Modernization. The idea was, how does the Catholic Church change itself, maintain its social influence in the face of modernization? Personally, I think it's a completely wrong approach, right? Because the Catholic Church was changing anyway. It didn't only change in reaction, it was changing, but it inspired me to be interested in studying the question. And thirdly, I've always been interested, my undergraduate thesis was on, as I said, the sociology of knowledge. Why do ideas find a hearing at some points in time and not in others? I studied Marx, Weber, Tönnies, Mannheim, and I wrote this, I still have it. I threw away first drafts of my dissertation, but I kept my undergraduate thesis. And I've always been interested in that question of ideas, right? Why do ideas convince people now and not some other time? And how do they turn them into action? There is not a better topic for this than religion, right? And so I devised back in the late 60s, early 70s, a research project which compared Venezuela and Colombia, a country with a powerful church, conservative, and a country with a weak church. And for that, I interviewed 60 bishops in two countries. It's amazing that they talked to me at all, right? But I interviewed 60 bishops. I built a thing around these interviews, and I did a series of community studies and case studies and organizations. It's an endlessly, then I just got more and more interested the more I got into it. I did that study, and then after a while I realized, well, you can't really understand religion if you think religion is just the institution. It's also the believers, it's the people. So then I devised another damn study which looked at base communities. Everyone was talking about Catholic-based communities. And I decided it would be nice to see what the reality was of these. So I devised a study which looked at them in two countries again, nationally, locally. I spent more time in peasant buses and in poor neighborhoods. I can't do that kind of work anymore. My knees won't do it. I got hepatitis, but I did. It's very rewarding. When you really get down to the level of ordinary life, you understand what it means to say that ideas make a difference or don't, how people treat them, how they get them. How do ideas reach people? You know, they're religious ideas, any kinds of ideas are not just some kind of mist that floats around and hits people. Somebody comes to you, they knock on the door, they give you a pamphlet, they talk to you, they try to convince you. I once traced the history of pamphlets, right? Who made them? How'd they get to this village? It's very interesting. So religion to me has been an endlessly interesting topic to study, but it's accidental that I studied it. I didn't go to law school because of Kalman Silvert's influence. I could have gone to law school. I had a different career, very interesting, and I haven't regretted it. My involvement with religion, my involvement in Latin America has immensely enriched my life, and it's a great topic. You meet a nice class of people. So that's the answer. There's a historical accident at the root of it, but I just found it really fascinating, and I still do. Thank you.